Talk about wireless. So we've been using over-the-air signals for television, right? Sending analog signals over the air for quite a long time. It's only natural that we would use this to move data that we would use over a network as well. So that's really what a wireless network is. You're just moving data in a different way than through a wire. That's it. So there's what we call the wireless spectrum. So there's all these electromagnetic waves that are present for data, voice communication. They have different frequencies from the lowest to the highest. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. It spans from the 9 kilohertz range to the 300 gigahertz range. So there's a very large spectrum of electromagnetic waves. Wireless is associated with one really tiny area of that spectrum. The FCC oversees frequencies in the United States. Who's the FCC? Federal Communications Commission. Some interesting things that have been happening lately you might have heard about. Drones are becoming quite commonplace, but there was the problem of who's supposed to regulate the drones. It ended up being the FCC because they're into communications and they're a federal entity, so that kind of makes sense. So they oversee the frequencies here. And then everything international is the ITU, that's the International Telecommunications Union. Because we have, if we don't have a physical wire, we have signals running through the air, they can propagate across borders, like between here and Canada, here in between Mexico. You could very easily propagate a signal over a border because it doesn't have a fixed medium to travel in. So the ITU regulates those. So here's what this spectrum looks like. So here we go from 9 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz frequency. And you can see wireless LANs are in this very small little area right here. On the grand scheme of things, we take up a very small amount, but you can see AM radio, FM radio, things that you've heard about, satellite, shortwave, WiMAX communications, like in the metropolitan areas, if they have clear or something like that that runs off of towers. It's almost kind of like cell phone service, but it's meant for data instead of phone signals. That's WiMAX. So we have a couple different things that, the ranges that these things can fall into. So a wireless transmission is kind of similar to a wired transmission when you break it down. So it uses a layer 3 or higher on the OSI model. And the signal comes from electrical current. It travels along a conductor just the same way that a wired signal would, but it doesn't have a fixed path. So instead of just traveling down this cable and only going down this cable, it can radiate past where you're intending for it to go, so it doesn't have a lot of guidance. You use an antenna to send this transmission, so to transmit or receive. And you have to have the same frequency on each antenna so that they can talk to each other. Different frequencies can't talk to each other. So here's an example. If we've got 2 wireless routing devices and 2 antennas on the same frequency, they're going to be able to transmit and receive on those antennas across whatever distance the maximum distance that they can go, which kind of depends, and we'll see in a minute, depends on the kind of wireless and the kind of device that we're talking about. So when you look at this picture, we're kind of hitting layer 1 because we have wired. We have to have some way to get the transmission to this, right? So we have a wired device there. And we're kind of hitting the data link layer 2. Again, a router, this little 4 ports in the back is a switch. It's a little small switch, but this is a switch, right? Where we can plug in our other things that need wired internet. In this case, the bits they're not on a physical wire between the 2 devices, they're in the air. We're used to thinking about bits on a wire as being layer 1, but really it's the same thing. Just the way that it's sent is a little bit different. When we talk about antennas, one of the big things we talk about is the range of the antenna. So this is the geographical area that this antenna can reach. Now, this becomes a big difference when you're actually trying to plot out where to put Wi-Fi in a building, in a house. This is why it's smart to plan where you're going to put what we call your demarcation point in a very smart way. So the demarcation point is the point between where your house and the things you're responsible for fixing ends, and the things that the telco company, where their responsibility begins. So that normally comes in the form of like a wall jack for us. There might be something attached to the outside of the house. But if it breaks on their end, they have to fix it. If it breaks inside the house on your end, you have to fix it. So here's an example of a cable or a phone jack that has been put in, and it's been put in over here in the corner of the house. So whether you buy a modem for yourself or they give you one, if you place it down here where this demarc is, it's not going to reach the rest of the house. This is the geographical range that this antenna provides. So you've got a sad little laptop over here because it can't get wireless, right? So a better way to do that would be to place it more in the middle of the house so that everybody gets reception. And we'll get to see that when we play our game in a little bit. So if you want to get good coverage, you do have to make sure you're putting your antenna within the range of everything in the house. We have different kinds of antennas we can use. I hope you enjoyed my very professional antenna drawings there. A directional antenna issues a signal along a single direction. So it just goes in that direction, whichever one it's pointing at, and that's it. An omnidirectional antenna, all direction, right, omnidirectional, receives those signals, but it does it in all directions. So it's 360 degrees of coverage all the way around, and it kind of looks like this. This, what does this look like? A satellite dish, right? So that's kind of an example of what a directional looks like. This is what we call a Yagi, or a high gain antenna. What does that look like? TV antenna, like the old style that you crank, you know, you go to, and you can turn it. The reason that that works is because it's extremely high gain, and it can send and receive signals for much longer distances. So that is directional long-range antenna. Another kind that you don't hear about very much, but it's a good cert question, is a patch antenna. So patch antenna, you would put up against a wall and it would radiate 180 degrees on that side of the wall. So our signal propagates in a line of sight down a straight line from transmitter to receiver. If they're pointed at each other, they're just going to talk to each other if they're directional or Yagi antennas. So line of sight is ideal. But in the real world, we have a lot of obstacles to overcome when it comes to antennas and for our wireless connections. So just like when the trees grow up in the spring and the summer, and suddenly you don't have the greatest satellite dish reception, and then in the fall they all fall off, and then it's great because there's nothing obstructing. It's the same kind of thing. That line of sight still applies. So there's lots of different things that can affect our signal. So the signals can just pass through them, kind of depending on what they are. They can be absorbed into them, or we can have some what they call phenomena that happen. So reflection is when the signal's reflected and it just gets bounced back to the source. Diffraction is when it kind of splits out into different waves. So it doesn't actually stop. It just doesn't go exactly in the way that it was before. And then there's scattering, which is when it gets diffused, but it happens kind of everywhere. Reflection occurs with metal a lot. Metal is a conductive surface. So that happens with metal, like filing cabinets, for example. There's giant, especially the medical filing cabinets. Diffraction, if you have like a mountain or a really tall building, it might hit the building and kind of split off into the way, but it's still kind of going in the same general direction it was. And then scattering could happen with chairs, books, computers, and things like that within an office. A multi-pass signal is when it follows different paths to get to the same definite destination. And that's caused by these phenomena that we just talked about. Now it does have a better chance of reaching the destination because there's several different kinds of signals going in different ways. But it is going to delay the signal. So when you look at the typical office building, you can see there's all kinds of things. it's kind of creepy when you think about the fact that wireless signals are going through us all the time, right? But for us, it's just kind of being absorbed. It's not, we're not conductive or anything. So, but when you look through the signal propagation, you can kind of see there's going to be ways to get this signal to this computer that aren't going to be a straight through path. We kind of don't think about that because as long as we get the signal, who cares, right? So when our signal runs into an obstacle, like the ones we just talked about, it starts to degrade or it starts to fade. So fading is a variation of that strength when it gets scattered, reflected, or diffracted off of a different kind of device, it starts to fade. When the signal weakens, we call that attenuation. So the further you move away from the thing that transmitted the signal in the beginning, the more it starts to weaken, the more it starts to attenuate. If you want to correct that, if you have an analog connection, you would use an amplifier to amplify that connection. If you have a digital signal, you would use something called a repeater. So that's one of the ways, a lot of times, when you're setting up access points in a building or something, you get to the very edge of the signal, but you need this one little room to have signal to, it just doesn't quite reach. You might use a repeater to put there and repeat that wireless signal, or probably wired signal. So in a wired network, attenuation is the reason that Ethernet standards say, hey, Cat5 cable can't go longer than 100 meters. Because by the time you get past 100 meters, it starts to attenuate to the point where you don't really see the original data anymore. So that's why that standard exists. And 100 meters is like 330 feet, somewhere in there. Noise is another problem. So when you have a Cat5 cable, you've got, you remember when we took them apart and put ends on them, they had this thick shielding around them. The expensive ones have shielding over each individual wire. All that shielding helps to keep noise from happening. But if we're in a wireless signal, we don't have all those things. So we are going to have some kind of noise or something that interferes with that signal because we don't have anything to insulate our wireless transmissions, right? So there's two frequencies for wireless communications. The first one is the oldest one, the 2.4 gigahertz range. We call it 2.4, but it's actually just a teeny bit bigger than just that one particular range, but that's okay. There's 11 channels in that, and it's susceptible to interference. The reason it's susceptible to interference is because at the time we were using it, everything was in the 2.4 gigahertz range. Like cordless phones, right? If your phone rang and you had wireless going in the house, it might drop your signal. Things like that. Baby monitors, like almost everything in the kitchen, microwaves, they all hang out on that 2.4 gigahertz frequency. So that does give you the susceptibility to have interference in your network. That's one of the reasons why we started using the much less crowded 5 gigahertz band in the newer wireless technologies. There's more bands, there's 24 bands there. And generally they're used by weather or military radar communications, but those are very long range things. Normally our little network is just going to be as big as our building. It's not really going to interfere with anything they do. So that's one of the reasons why we still use that.
A lot of home routers are now coming with both 2.4 to 5 gigahertz wireless. The one I have at home is a dual band.
It's a dual band, so it's either or.
Yeah.
But that's what we're fixing to talk about.
But I can I said propagate, that's the wrong word, but I can combine them into a 600 gigahertz.
Or you can do, if you have a dual band, which that's what we're talking about, dual band is one or the other, concurrent band is both. And we're going to look at the differences between those and why one is better than the other. Looks like my video's not working for some reason, but that's fine. So you can call it dual and concurrent. There's a couple different ways, and it kind of depends on the manufacturer as to what they call it. But the general principle is you can have a selectable band where you transmit on both, but only one at a time. So only one of those bands is active. So if a device needs to be on that band, then the whole network has to be on that band. So you have one single, really crowded wireless network to work with. So a simultaneous band is where both are up and active and you can transmit on either one of them. So you essentially have two wireless networks. Now as you'll see when we do our lab on Wednesday, you can make different changes for each band. Like they can have different passwords, have different security attached to them. But you kind of have a high-speed 5.0 network, and the reason it's high speed is there's not as many things on it to fight over that signal, right? So this is like the high-performance routers. They're probably going to be over $100, maybe 120, somewhere in there. But they're going to provide that kind of functionality. It's handy to have around. So like at our house, we have a concurrent band. We have two bands up. Now the reason for that is anything on like a PC or my iPhone or something, I'm going to use the 5 gigahertz because it's less crowded. But I have one of those old Kindle Fires, and it only works on the 2.4. So if I didn't have that 2.4 band open, I couldn't use the Kindle Fire on the Wi-Fi, right? So sometimes it's nice to have those things around for maybe legacy devices or things that were just made before we had a 5 gigahertz band to work with. So that is a nice thing to be able to have. We have a couple different kinds of wireless systems that we can have. So with fixed communications, the transmitters and the receivers don't move, they're fixed in their spot. The antenna focuses energy directly towards the receiving, and you have what we call a point-to-point. If there's two of them, and we've had a couple questions about that in the CCNA book, point-to-point just means one device to another device. So you need two IP addresses, right? So you don't have any wasted energy issuing signals towards things where there's not a receiver to pick anything up. So that's good. And you have more energy to use on that signal itself, so it's less likely to attenuate or fade. A mobile communications wireless system is where the receiver can be located anywhere within the range. So when you pull up your laptop and sit on the couch, you're taking advantage of a mobile communications wireless system because you can sit on the couch, you can sit in the internet cafe, you can go sit in your car probably and get Wi-Fi. So you're not fixed to the spot, just the stuff giving the signal is. So you might kind of think to yourself, why would you need a fixed communications wireless system? If it's fixed, why don't you just make it wired? Why would you do that?
Wired may not be practical.
Why?
Because you can't get in the walls, and maybe the distance, it could be a variety of different things.
Could
Just
be
cost.
Cost. So wireless is a whole lot cheaper to set up than wired. Because wired you have to run a bunch of cable and you might have to get in the ceiling and it's messy and gross and nobody wants to do that, right? There could be some instances where you can't get in the walls. There could be some instances where you can't get in the walls even though you could. Like if it's a historical building or something, you can't do things like that because you're ruining that historical marker according to what the city or the county says. So there are definitely instances where you will have everything be fixed but have to have wireless transmission. When you go to set things up. Another good example of the mobile communication systems that I've seen is servers at restaurants now are taking orders on the iPads, which is just cool. I think that's really cool. And a fixed communications way to look at that is it Chili's or Applebee's that has the Is it Applebee's? Chili's. It's got the fixed point on the table, so you can kind of all pay for your order and stuff, and order more drinks and all that. So just in that one environment, you could have both. You could be fixed or you could be mobile, just kind of depending on the company and what they want. So the standard that we use for our wireless LANs is 802.11. So that's what IEEE got together when they said, hey, this is what wireless is going to look like. They assigned that number to it, and that's why you see it all the time. So 802.11. So this describes the functions of the different kinds of layers and what that signaling is going to look like. So the standards that we have that we need to know are 802.11b, A, G, and N. Now, you'll notice these are not in alphabetical order, right? B came before A. Some of the characteristics that they share is half duplexing and the access method. So when we talked about wireless communications, we talked about CSMA-CD, Carrier Sense Multiple Access Collision Detection. That's when it sends out to see if anybody else is talking, and if it is, it jams, it does the random back-off timer, and then it tries again, right? So, the access method that we would use in wireless communications, instead of collision detection, is collision avoidance. And it works quite a bit the same way. Hopefully my video on that works, right? So what it does as far as the source and destination is it's going to append an address to the frame. So we know that we talk about routers, we talk about level 3, and we talk in MAC addresses. I'm sorry, we talk about IP addresses. When we talk about layer 2, we talk about MAC addresses. So it's appending that information to the frame as well. So it's got this physical addressing scheme as well as the logical addressing scheme that is our layer 3 stuff. So wireless devices are not designed for the same antenna to transmit and receive at the same time. That's the half duplexing part. They can't detect collisions because it's in the air. If it was over a wire, it would be real easy to detect a collision. But since it's not, it can't do that. So it uses a different kind of access method. So when you look at your network connection details over something wireless, you will see a MAC address associated there. So instead of using this jam signal as our top priority with collision avoidance, we're going to use an ACK packet. What's ACK mean?
Acknowledge.
Acknowledge, right? So it's going to use an ACK packet to verify all the different transmissions.
CSMA-CD and CSMA-CA. Collision happens between two packets sent on the same hub-connected network. The packets are on the transmission medium at the same time, they interfere with each other and neither reaches its respective destination.
CSMA stands for Carrier Sense Multiple Access. It is essentially an ear that listens for network traffic on a transmission medium, usually an Ethernet or wireless connection. It is this transmission medium that determines the method used to minimize collision on a network. Collision detection, CD, is used on a wired network since collisions between packets are detected. Imagine your computer is you trying to say hello to a friend through cans attached to a string. You would first listen to make sure nobody else is talking and then say hello. If there are other people talking on the line, you wait a random amount of time and try again. If another person is talking at the same time you are, the two messages become jumbled and nobody will understand. You would then wait a random amount of time and attempt to send the packet again. This is the way collision detection. Wireless networks work a little differently. Since packets are sent on wireless radio bands, collision is unable to be detected. In this case, collision avoidance, CA, is used. So you're a computer again, and instead of talking through a can on a string, you're trying to yell a message across a field to your friend. You first listen to make sure there isn't a tractor or something making noise, and yell your message across the field. If there was a tractor making noise, you would stop, wait a random amount of time, and try to yell to your friend again. Since there is no collision detection, you must receive acknowledgement from your friend that he heard your message. If, say, a bee started buzzing at the same time you were yelling, your friend would not hear you. You'd wait a random amount of time and yell at your friend again. This is not the perfect analogy, but it gives you a rough idea of how collision avoidance works. No matter what way you're connecting to your network, CSMACD and CSMACA are used to increase the performance of your network by decreasing the frequency of collisions. Thanks for watching, and I hope this helped you understand these topics.
Okay, so instead of the back-off algorithm, we are acknowledging every single transmission that comes over wireless. What does that mean for our network? More overhead. It could possibly slow it back down. It depends, right? It depends on the way the network is configured. But just like with TCP, TCP takes more packets and more overhead because it's connection oriented. That's essentially what this is making this become, with the constant acknowledgement that something has been received. The SSID, or the Service Set Identifier, is a string of characters that identifies the access point. So that's what, when you go to a new place on your phone or your laptop and you see, here's the list of all the networks that are available. This is my favorite, FBI Surveillance Band number 42. I also enjoy Pretty Fly for the Wi-Fi. That's my second favorite SSID. So this is what you configure when you're plugging in your router, your access point, and putting all these things together. This makes it so that you can tell what your network is. Now, the cardinal rule of making an SSID, does anybody know what it is?
I'm sorry.
What's the number one rule in making an SSID? Okay, that's a good one.
Well, for security, or what do you mean?
Yeah, it's for security.
Just don't make it available.
Okay, those are all good things. I'm going even more basic than that. Don't make it something that's an indication of where it is, unless you want it to be a network other people get to. So McDonald's names their Wi-Fi McDonald's Wi-Fi, right? I don't necessarily want to do that at my business and then enable an SSID so that when people are driving down the street, they go, oh, let me see what I can do, right? So it shouldn't really be something that's indicative. If you're trying to keep it secure, it shouldn't be something that's indicative of where the Wi-Fi is located. That might give people clues to be able to get into it, right? And as we learned with Wireshark, if you can get onto a network, you can just pull up Wireshark and watch everything that happens on it. So that's maybe not a good idea. So this shouldn't be something that's distinguishable to you or your company. And if possible, it should absolutely be hidden. And that's just a checkbox in your router configuration. We'll do that on Wednesday. So if you've got, for example, this college, there's no way you could buy an antenna that would reach this entire building. There's no way. It's way too big. So what you would do is you would have an extended service set. So you have a group of access points that are all connected. They're all connected to the same local area network, but as you walk through the halls with your phone or whatever, and you're connected to this extended service set, it will connect to the next access point as you get to it. When you get past the edge of that access point, it will connect to the next one. So you never drop, you never lose your signal. It sounds easy to do that, but when it comes to configuring it, it's not so much. You normally have to buy some fairly expensive equipment to be able to get that to be done correctly. But that all comes up. Sometimes you might have a firewall, and then you can connect access points to the firewall all the way down. So if it finds that, hey, you're in a spot where there's several access points that all kind of overlap over the spot, it's just going to connect the one with the strongest signal and hopefully the one with the lowest error rate if it's smart enough, where maybe the least number of packets are being dropped, or the bandwidth is higher on this one for whatever reason. Maybe someone else is using another access point to download something and the speed has just gone way down because of that. Now this does pose a security risk because there's something called a rogue access point. So a rogue access point is basically one that maybe you've updated your stuff since then and all your access points are in the ceiling and you forgot that this one was up there. So this one is using maybe weaker encryption than the new stuff you just installed. If somebody could compromise that, they could run Wireshark and then see everything that happens on the network. So that access point has gone rogue, right? It doesn't have the same security implemented, probably not the same encryption. Maybe it's like WEP encryption, which is really, really easy to hack. So that's example of one thing that you would want to watch if you were doing the access point that you could roll in between with. So if you have a single base service set, basic service set, then maybe in this one room you've just got one thing that's emitting wireless signal, it's a router, and everything in the room just talks to that one device. Whereas if you've got an extended service set in these different rooms, they're all connected to a LAN, but each one of the rooms has a different device that's emitting the signal. So that's an example of the extended service set. So if you drop from one access point and you connect to another one as you're walking down the hall or something, that is called reassociation. You're reassociating to the network. Any questions so far before I start talking about the specific network kinds? No. So the 802.11b, that was the first wireless standard that was created. So it was on that 2.4 gigahertz band because at the time that's what we had to use, right? It was separated into several different channels. So the throughput is how fast it is, how much data can you move through that connection. So there's always a theoretical and an actual. And the theoretical makes me laugh sometimes because I'm like, really? There's no way. The 11 megs is the theoretical and 5 megs is what you would actually see. The node limit is 100 meters, meaning it only worked for 100 meters, right? Like each wireless router could only span that far. And it's oldest, it's least expensive, but it was replaced by G. Now the next one to come out was 802.11a. So what was different about it is it was on the 5 gigahertz band, so there was less interference because there's less things on the 5 gigahertz band. So you see that the throughput went up quite a bit, so 54 megs theoretical, but the limit, whoa, that went down a lot. So like our B was 100 meters, this is 20 meters. So you're going to have additional access points because the range is a whole lot smaller with this particular standard. Now this is rarely preferred. So one of the applications I've actually seen this used in where it didn't really matter if the limit was smaller as long as it was faster is like warehouses where all they do is inventory and they scan barcodes all day. And they make sure that things move in and out like a shipping and receiving kind of place. That it's common to see wireless A with that, even though it's not the newest, right? But if they built their infrastructure on it and it still works, why change it, right?
This turtle on 24 has placed on 802.11g. Is that a mistake? On the one before, the slide before?
No, that's not a mistake.
Oh, okay. But you said 8.
That's the next one we're going to talk about.
Oh, okay.
So A, the whole reason that we have A is so we could have faster throughput on the other band that's available. That's the whole reason. So rarely preferred because it doesn't have a lot of practical application unless it's a certain circumstance. Now, what did replace wireless B was wireless G. So our throughput is the same as the wireless A. The node range is the same as wireless B. So essentially the difference between B and G is the throughput. Everything else is the same. So we just made it faster, right? Now what you're going to commonly see today is the N standard. Now there's one that came after this. Do y'all know what that is?
AC.
AC. AC is the newest thing. Now it's not necessarily been adopted because it's so new. people tend to not fix things unless they're
It's
broken.
like N, when it came out, it took a long time.
It
to
took
be-
years
Yeah.
for N to become the new standard. It's gonna take years for AC to become the new standard. But what we're generally using now is N. So, as you can see, the throughput, whoa, okay, it went way up. And of course, what was great about N is it was backwards compatible with everything. And it could work in either or both of the frequency ranges that were available to us. So it's faster and it's more compatible. Another thing that's great about 802.11n, and this was the first wireless standard to give us this, it's got what we call MIMO, multiple input, multiple output. So basically you put more than one antenna on your wireless access point, and it can receive and send 3 times the stuff. Because we know that there's a half duplex thing going on there, right? They can't send and receive at the same time. But if we add more antennas, while one's receiving, the other one can send. Hey, that's handy. Why didn't we think of that like 10 years ago, right? Well, the problem was we didn't have the throughput to be able to handle it. But with this, we do. So this is going to make everything easier for everyone, right? So just a summary of the wireless standards that we talked about. If you want to study something for the quiz that we'll have coming up next Monday, that would be a good thing to study. So, in my experience, in reality, you choose the newest standard and you give the customer that equipment because it's the newest stuff. So if N is the newest stuff now, that's probably what you set someone up with. Now there may be specialized situations like the warehouse thing with 802.11a where that's preferred, but in general, you're probably going to pick the newest standard. Now, the reason you need to know these things, when you get to your Net Plus exam, they will say, there's a customer that has such and such, that needs this frequency and this amount of throughput, which standard would you give them? In that case, the answer is not always in. So that's why it's important to get started kind of putting this stuff in the back of your head now, so when you get to the Net Plus, you can answer those kinds of questions. So when we talk about actually implementing wireless LANs and designing it, there's a difference between doing like a small home office and then enterprise planning for TSTC's campus. You're going to need different equipment. It's a different grade of equipment. It's going to be more expensive. There's going to be a lot more things you can configure on it and do with it. And then there's some pitfalls and things like that we're going to talk about and how that would be configured. So you either need, you might need one access point. If it's a small enough area, one access point will do it. That access point could be your router, right? That's just the thing that gives you access to the wireless network. That could be your router. So you could combine switching, routing functions. It could connect to the LAN with the wired thing in the back, right, the wired port. And it can act as your gateway to get to the internet. So in that case, it's just your router's giving off the signal. So you do need to take into consideration the distance and make sure it's going to work the whole way. And think about the obstacles and things like that you might come across when you're developing this network. So here's an example of, hey, this is just a one access point thing, right? The access point is the router, it gives off the signal, and it goes far enough that everybody in the house can get signal, and that's good. So if you have something larger, you're probably going to have to do what they call a site survey. So that's just where you take maybe an iPad or a computer, maybe you assess what they already have and see where are the blank spots where they don't get coverage where they need it. Because then you need an access point there. Or maybe you need something that's going to reach a little farther so it gets to that area. That determines where you're going to put those wireless access points. And then you can go to those farthest corners and see, well, okay, if I make this change, will they be able to get network here? So you might just carry around some kind of device and see where the signal drops and you're not able to get anything. Or maybe where the signal degrades like down to 1 bar. And you can't really do anything with that, so now we need some kind of access point or we need to move them around. So if you're going to install a bunch of access points, they all need to be within that extended service set that we talked about. You're also probably gonna have wired and wireless together, so that's a good time to think about how can I integrate those changes but put them together. So generally, if a building is wired, it doesn't get changed very often unless, like we did that a couple semesters ago, all these tables were along the outside edge, and like we used that whiteboard and it was terrible. So when we replaced these this way, we didn't have drops along the line, so we had to get up in the ceiling and run the drops. It was awful, but I'm glad it's over with. So in that case, we had wires run, but we had to redo all of them. So like our switch is back there in that corner. So we had to run wires that would go all the way to here and then put jacks in the wall to run to each individual computer. Generally, unless you move things around like that, you're probably not touching the stuff that's already in the wall because it's messy and it's not fun. So, how is it going to integrate? So, if I'm putting access points in the ceiling, I need to run wires to connect all the access points together. So that's something to consider, right? Can I daisy chain them all together? Do they all need to go back to one central switch? It depends on the way that the hardware works. Maybe for multiple offices and floors of a building, you're going to have to run wire up every single floor. It just kind of depends. Now I can tell you that no one ever complains that the Wi-Fi is too dependable or too fast. So when you're talking about putting in a wireless infrastructure, it's cool to spend money there, okay? So you can buy the fancy stuff, you can buy the things with many years of warranty because it makes a big difference. And I can tell you that I had a customer at one point that wanted wireless in their business, and they were in, it was one of those things where you couldn't get through the walls, and they wanted wireless because they didn't want to run cables down the walls. They thought that would look tacky. And, you know, you would notice it, right? It maybe doesn't look the best. So we put wireless up in there, but we said, hey, you're across the street from the hospital. They're emanating from Good Shepherd. They're emanating all kinds of wireless communications. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. But they wanted it anyway. So we installed it all, and of course it's terrible. It drops all the time. It's incredibly slow. Everybody hates it. So we ended up having to go back and run cable along the walls just like they didn't want us to do. I should mention they got charged for both things, right? So not only were they mad that the internet didn't work after we told them it wasn't going to, because I don't know if y'all noticed, but people don't like being wrong, really. We're not into that. They had to pay for it twice. But hey, guess what? All the wired stuff works great because it has that channel to travel down. It's not going to go getting fuzzy around the edges. All the other wireless things aren't going to come in and degrade the signal. So it's good to put money into your equipment for the infrastructure of your business, right? Plan for the worst, hope for the best, right? Like with everything in life. So here's an example for multiple floors. Maybe they have racks or something that are all connected, and they've got their infrastructure devices. And see, in this case, they're all nice. That drop wouldn't be that hard to do, right? You're just going all the way. Now, if they wanted to be over here, then you run into things like that, right? Okay, my cardinal rule of routers. Okay, I have another cardinal rule. How many of those can you have? I have at least like 4. So when you go to configure some kind of wireless device, there's generally 2 ways you can do it. You can plug it into your computer, put in the address, and log into it, or you can use the CD that comes with it. A lot of them come with a CD. We're not using CDs. CDs are for noobs, okay? We're doing it the hard way. We're consoling into the router, and we're going to connect it that way. So you can use that CD-ROM. Hey, if you're not real comfortable with wireless routers yet, that is a good way to do it. For like a home user, it's not quite sure. Hey, I know I need a password on it, but I don't really know anything else. That's great for them. But it's my job to make you uncomfortable so you learn. So we're not going to do that. But when you go to set up during installation, you might put an administrator password on the router. Why would you do that? You don't want anybody else accessing it and messing up your stuff, changing it to lock you back out, right? Another reason you might do that is, let's take Linksys for example. Every Linksys router, the default The username is admin and the default password is blank. So if you figure out somebody's got a Linksys router, hey, a lot of people do. That's a real popular brand. If they don't change the admin username and password, you can get into any Linksys router with that knowledge. There are websites on the internet that show, hey, for every kind of router, here's the default username and password. So if that's not changed, I can get in anybody's router, right?
Well, that assumes that you don't have a passphrase to connect to the wireless.
It doesn't matter, you can still get to the router.
Okay. If physically, yeah, if you can physically get to the router, but not wireless. You think about it.
You can crack that passphrase. We did it in my security class last week.
WPA Enterprise.
A home user's not gonna have enterprise.
I use
Do you have a Radius server?
it. No.
How do you use enterprise?
Oh, I'm sorry, personal.
Personal, okay.
It's still strong enough, you're not gonna get through
WPA
it.
too, yeah. But if somebody didn't know better and they had WEP, because they just click something,
Yeah, because if they just hook it up out of the box, it doesn't have anything set.
and yeah. So if they just plugged it in and said, oh, I have a router now, which a lot of people do, and it just assigns like this random string of numbers for the router and it's probably an open network, yeah, you could do that. So you can figure out that password, the SSID, so that's what we're naming our network, and we don't want it to be something that shows who we are, like, can't be, this is the Wi-Fi for the Hurdle house, that's a terrible idea, right? Whether or not DHCP is used, y'all remember what DHCP is?
Dynamic host control protocol.
Yep, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, that's the thing that gives us IP addresses from the higher power, right? So you can determine what's the thing that's going to give out addresses in your network. Is it going to be this router? That's cool if it's just a home environment, but like in this room, I already have a server that gives me IP addresses. So I don't want anything else handing out IP addresses because it's going to mess stuff up. Whether or not we broadcast that SSID, and then our security options like our different kinds of encryption. So those different kinds of encryption are open, so the network may still have a password on it, but it just means there's no way to encrypt the data. So encryption is basically using an algorithm that's been predefined to scramble stuff when it's in transmission, and then when it gets to the other end, it descrambles it. A couple of the other ones, or a few of the other ones we've got is WEP. WEP is not secure, it's not a good idea to use it. That means it's been cracked. So once some encryption gets cracked, or hash gets cracked and they figure out how to use it, we don't use it anymore. We come up with something new. WPA and WPA2. So the configuration is going to vary, and I can tell you as far as where the menus go, as you'll see on Wednesday, it's all in different spots. But we're going to look at a few different kinds of routers and see how that works. So some pitfalls to our wireless configuration. If we're trying to set up access points, all the SSIDs need to match. We may put different kinds of encryption on the routers, but maybe one of them is correct. Maybe we accidentally put WEP on an access point. Well, that wouldn't be good, because we know that's not a good one. We may put the incorrect channel or frequency. So when we put channels in, we want our frequencies to match. We want our channels to not overlap. So there should be like 5 degrees of separation between channels. So maybe I'll put something on 1, something on 6, and something on 11. So they're all apart. Channels don't overlap, there won't be any interference. We may accidentally put something that's wireless B on a network that's got a lot of wireless in stuff. Not saying it won't work, but the throughput's going to be different, right? So that access point's going to be slower than all the other ones. Maybe we don't want to do that. We may also put our antennas up, but they're not placed correctly, so that not everybody gets access, and we don't want that. And then interference. Interference is the kind of thing, they have something that's called a wireless spectrum analyzer that's a piece of equipment that will show you, hey, here's every single wireless emanation that's occurring in this spot you're standing in. So they're really expensive, they're like thousands of dollars, but they're really neat. So you might be able to, hey, if I want people down the hallway in every classroom to get a wireless signal, maybe I would take that and I would walk into each classroom, because there's a lot of electronics on this campus. I don't know if you've looked in these windows, but there's all kinds of stuff around here that could generate some kind of signal that could mess up my wireless. So maybe I would take that device and go to each classroom and say, okay, what's in this room that's causing interference? Can I do something about it, or do I need to take some kind of special precautions with my wireless?
The 330 feet, the 100 meters is theoretical, isn't it?
Yeah,
Because I've
it's a
never,
maximum theoretical, which is even worse, right?
well, yeah, because I've never seen anything, even in a open line of shot, go that far.
Oh yeah, and like in homes, if people have a really big house, and by really big, I mean like more than 3,000 square foot, one router's not gonna cut it no matter what kind of router you get. They're gonna have to have something else. So some people may end up like putting a switch up in the attic, if it's climate controlled, and then running everything from the switch down to individual rooms. I've seen people do that. But yeah, I think my house is like 1,200 square foot. It's not very big, and I still have trouble with access. So, yeah. It depends, but that's why you can do your site survey and go through
Your
it.
interference comes into play.
Oh, yes.